While waiting at the airport terminal for her plane to begin boarding, a woman sat reading a newspaper. Earlier, she had purchased a package of cookies in the airport snack shop to eat after she got on the plane. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the man sitting next to her was eating a cookie. She looked down and noticed that her package of cookies had been opened and the man was eating them. The woman couldn't believe that the man would have such a nerve to eat her cookies. So that she wouldn't lose all of her cookies to the man, she slowly reached over and took a cookie and ate one herself. To her amazement, the man continued to eat more cookies. Getting more and more irritated, the woman removed all but one cookie from the package and ate them. At that point, the man reached down and took the last cookie. Before eating it, though, he broke it in half and left half the cookie for the woman. This made the woman so angry she grabbed the empty package with the half cookie and crammed it in her purse. Then, to her shock, she noticed that there in her purse was her unopened package of cookies. In a simplified form with a less emotionally fraught sin to consider, stealing cookies rather than adultery, I think this story invites us to think about the question that I want us to reflect on today. How do we respond to sin? And before we start, I just want to say to anyone here for whom adultery is a personally painful topic, please know that I don't agree with the law of Moses, which suggests that the death penalty is appropriate for adultery. I think, like Julie said last week, it is one of those kinds of painful situations where we can see how sin leads to death. Death of trust, death of hope, death of relationship, death of self-regard. And I also understand that adultery often arises out of a context which is already full of death. And it can be more a symptom of struggle than a conscious choice to oneself or others. So if you are coping with the pain of relationships under severe stress, past or present, please know that I have no desire to condemn you, and I don't think adultery is a worse sin than others just because it has to do with sex. And we want to be a place where we can acknowledge how hard it is at times to build life-enhancing intimate relationships. So if it helps whenever I say adultery, feel free to substitute another word. Burglary, vandalism, arson, whatever works. So then let's turn to our Bible story for today. I think in this story we see several common responses to sin. The story begins with shaming and blaming and condemnation, and heck, maybe even scapegoating. Do the religious leaders actually care at all about the woman and her alleged sin? Or are they merely using her to try to trap Jesus without any regard for her personhood at all? You see, if we consider the broader context of this story, there is more than just righteous indignation driving the action of those religious leaders. While they may be offended by her adultery, they are also trying to trap Jesus. In fact, in just the previous chapter of John's Gospel, they have been plotting to get him arrested and are frustrated when the temple police refuse to do so. So now they are trying to present Jesus with what they think is a no-win situation. If Jesus sentences the woman to death, then he is infringing on Roman authority, because only Roman officials can pass death sentences. But if he doesn't, then he's not respecting the law of Moses, and what kind of prophet or rabbi or teacher doesn't respect the law of Moses? In either case, the religious leaders hope that they can get the Roman authorities or the Jewish crowds who are in Jerusalem for the festival to turn against Jesus. Of course, the religious officials are not really respecting the law of Moses themselves either, since they have brought just one person in front of Jesus. And we all know that adultery is not a sin you can commit all by yourself. And the law of Moses also requires that there be witnesses brought to testify. And there is zero evidence in this story that they have brought any witnesses to testify, or that they are even suggesting that the woman deserves to have her case heard before judgment is made. Rather, like a street mob, they are trying to get Jesus to condone a summary execution. But assuming that this isn't just a trap, and the religious authorities truly are outraged by her action, their response is also a common human response to sin: shame, blame, and condemnation. They take her out and stand her in front of everyone and ask Jesus to judge her. Imagine what she must have felt like in that moment. Where is her companion? What led to this moment? What are her circumstances, her story, her reasons for her actions? Heck, the story doesn't even tell us her name. For centuries, Christians have been referring to her as the woman caught in adultery. She is dragged out in front of everyone and condemned by the religious leaders as a symbol of wrongdoing. They effectively say, here is the evil one, the sinful one. Heap all your hatred on her. She deserves it. But before we start condemning the religious authorities for condemning her, I think we do need to recognize that there is a part of most of us that wants to respond this way to sin. We want to find someone to blame. And it might be easier to acknowledge that part of ourselves if we think about the story with the cookies. If you are anything like me, your initial instinctual response might resemble the woman who thinks her cookies have been stolen. Righteous indignation. How dare he take my cookies? And while I would like to think that I am not as spiteful as the religious leaders who dragged the woman in front of Jesus to accuse her of adultery, on my bad days, I just might be more like them than I would care to acknowledge. You see, when I feel like someone has done something wrong, especially something wrong to me, my initial response is often judgment or condemnation. I'm not proud of that response, yet it feels way healthier to know that about myself and to recognize that the initial wave of anger I feel at what I perceive as wrongdoing or sin or injustice may not be the energy from which I really want to respond to the situation. And if it isn't convenient or possible to blame, shame, or condemn someone else, well, then I'm often willing to blame, shame, or condemn myself for the mistakes I have made and the sins I have committed. It feels better to hold someone responsible for the sin, even if it's me, than to have no one who is personally accountable for it. In the story of the woman with the cookies, I wonder what comes next. What happens when she realizes that far from the man next to her stealing her cookies, she has been stealing his? Is she filled with shame? Does she confess, or just secretly wish that she could disappear? Does she blame him for having the same kind of cookies that she does? Does she change seats? What would you do? In our Bible story, what comes next is that Jesus intervenes. Instead of either condemning or condoning her behavior, he writes in the dirt. We don't know what he writes. Lots of speculation has happened over centuries about what the message in the dust is in this story. But regardless of what it was, when he says, "Let the person among you who is without sin throw the first stone at her," they all leave, starting with the oldest. I have always loved this detail in this story. The oldest leave first. They are the first to realize that they are not without sin. And this fits with my experience. As a young woman, I much more often thought there is right and there is wrong, and I will choose the right. I just have to learn how to choose the right. Well, now I know that it is much more complicated than that. Now I know that while it still matters to try to choose what is good or right, or at least more good or more right, I make those choices as imperfect person in an imperfect world, and that absolute right and wrong may not exist, and if they do, they are definitely beyond my ability to discern. I am a sinful person and always will be. And some days, knowing that I am a sinful person leaves me feeling ashamed or broken. But I'm working on that, because I know that shame and self-condemnation do not bring out the best in me. Rather, they tend to lead me further into sin against myself, against God, and against others. Instead, I'm working to allow the knowledge that I am not without sin, that I am broken, that I break things, to move me towards deeper compassion for our common humanity. After the crowd leaves, the woman is still standing there, probably expecting Jesus to reprimand or condemn her. But Jesus stands up and speaks to her. He says he asks if anyone has condemned her, and when she replies that no one has, he says that he doesn't either, and invites her to go on her way, sinning no more. We can hear Jesus' words in a couple of ways. We can hear them as an order. I'm not going to punish you today, but don't do it anymore. Or we can hear them as an invitation. I don't condemn you. Take this opportunity to live in a new way. And given what we know about Jesus, I think it is probably the latter. He is offering her grace and forgiveness and inviting her to live in a new way. And this, I think, also invites us to a different way of responding to sin, whether it's our own sin or the sin of someone else. Let's remember some words that some of you might remember from the Church of Youth. They're found in Romans. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. None of us is without sin. Brokenness and sin are part of our human condition, in ourselves and in other people. So when we remember our shared sinfulness, we are invited to put down the stones, to stop condemning ourselves and others, to stop adding injury on top of sin. Instead, we are invited to allow the recognition that we are all in this together, to move our hearts towards compassion. And grounded in that compassion, creative responses to sin become possible. We may find the courage to speak of sin and shame, and thus find ways to transform brokenness and death into salvation and new life. A space may be created where forgiveness might grow, forgiveness of ourselves and forgiveness of one another. And we can try to live differently as a result. For the goal is not to wallow in our sinfulness or to avoid being held accountable when we sin, but rather to open up new possibilities for transformation, to allow us to begin to live again and love in God's way. And as much as it might seem counterintuitive in those moments when we are filled with righteous indignation, the truth is that love and compassion are better motivators for change than shame and condemnation ever could be. So let's go forth to practice radical compassion, like Jesus did. A compassion that has the potential to transform us in ways we may not even be able to imagine right now, so that we can go forth and find new life in the midst of our own and the world's sinfulness. Thanks be to God. Amen.